This is the All Solar Texas YouTube channel. Our viewers are going to be really excited to kind of hear what you have to say as well. So why don't you introduce yourself to the channel and talk a little bit about your background?
So I'm a meteorologist, and I've spent most of my career offering commercial services to the much of the energy industry. I've spent a lot of time working with oil and gas companies, with energy trading, with the electric utilities. There's probably not an industry on the planet that's more exposed to severe weather impacts than the electric utility industry. Still most of our wires are above ground, and they're exposed to the weather, both lightning and wind and ice. And there's just to reinforce the grid such that those wires are not going to go down when we have severe weather would cost way more money than we could afford. So we just live in a world where we've got some exposure and there's some fragility to that system. And frankly, I think the fragility of that system is going to get worse, not better, in the coming years. So I thought that merger of having your own distributed generation system, rooftop solar and either generator or battery storage backup, is something that I think that everybody's going to seriously consider in the coming years.
Yeah, that's something that you and I actually share in common is a love and a background with the utility industry. So, my background was in utility construction. Weather events was a significant contributor to large scale grid outages. I was responsible for not only constructing new power lines, but reconstructing lines once they'd been damaged by wind, blowing a tree, hitting a circuit, taking out the whole line, taking out power, or lightning strikes, causing a surge. People out celebrating and having a little too much to drink and then plowing into one or two poles and knocking out the power, right? But the weather was by far the largest threat at the time because it's seasonal, but these weather events kept getting worse and worse and worse, and they became more and more unpredictable, where the winds were much stronger than the last 50 years. And so the design of these assets and the infrastructure when they were designed and installed didn't factor in these 1 in 100 year type of weather events. And now we're seeing them once every 50, once in every 10 years now, where it used to be these things were few and far between. And now it seems as though that scale is getting much smaller in terms of when these things start to occur, and the scale of the impact is getting much larger. And as we're more electrified as a civilization, right, we're not going the other way. We're becoming more electrified, which means that this is a complete recipe for absolute disaster.
Yeah, we're getting more dependent all the time. We've got more and more, whether it's medical devices or just our standard of living, our lifestyles are more and more dependent on electricity with our communications. And it really just looks to me like it's so simple to really distance yourself from some of those risks with, you don't necessarily have to go off grid, but there's a lot of people that want to do that. But just to have that backup, some people want redundancy, more than one form of backup power. And then when you look at the cost to maintain the infrastructure of the grid, or the cost of the fuel possibly going up in the years to come, and just general inflation means that the cost of those kilowatt hours that we're pulling off the grid, I think it's inevitable it's going to be going up in the future.
Yeah, I mean, someone has to pay for that, right? So you have multiple demands specifically here in Texas. Texas is a unique market. We're not interconnected with the other larger, eastern western grids. We're on our own. We kind of have a nice little island for our grid that's regulated by ERCOT. But I mean, you have increased population. People are moving here by the thousands every day. millions every year. And so that's increasing the demand on our electric supply. You also have businesses moving here. Tesla, right, just moved, their large gigafactory here. You have a bunch of new businesses coming in and starting. That's going to demand more power. And then you have weather events that are, becoming more and more drastic. We've had record summers the last 2 summers, so they've been hotter than they've been in decades. You also have had several freezes now over the winter months. It's not getting more convenient for the grid to stay the way it is. In fact, it's more of a threat today that it has been in the past, and I suspect it's going to continue to grow and be an even greater threat in the future.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that the renewables on the utility scale, industrial scale utilities, the generation that's coming from solar and wind, that has to be transported long distance. We've got a growing and growing segment of our generation capability is these renewables, but because they're intermittent, it actually in some ways makes the grid more vulnerable.
Mm.
But when you look at the term they use is distributed generation for taking that generation down more and more towards a microgrid, down to the neighborhood level, down to the street level, or down to the individual user level in terms of rooftop solar, that actually makes the grid more resilient. It makes our communities more resilient. If more and more of the people in your community have these resilient resources, so that when we do have a grid outage, you don't have everybody exposed to the failures, and everybody depending on each other. If half of your community has their own backup power systems and can perpetually, with the sun coming up every day and charging their batteries, or the generators running, if a big part of your community is resilient that way, especially if the businesses are as well, then the whole system, the whole community, the whole network across the state is more and more resilient.
Yeah, well, once we start
So
looking at that distributed generation, right, it does two things. Number one, it takes load off the grid because now you're not having to pool electricity from transmission lines, from substations, from distribution lines, right? It puts the generation right on your roof or in your backyard if you have a ground mount. So it takes load off the grid, which is taking pressure and stress off the grid. It also allows you or enables you, if you scaled your system right, to be a net producer of electricity. Now you're putting electricity and extra generation onto the grid that's going to be consumed locally by your community. So we're not having to pay, to have these large generation stations, right, transport or transmit this electricity over these large transmission wires and all the interconnected systems and all the equipment that's needed there. It's locally sourced. It's locally sourced electricity, and it helps offset the demand that we see that's increasing. And we know that those costs are going to trickle down to the customers. The cost to make the grid more resilient, the cost to install new grid lines, or to make transformers more robust by swapping them out maybe before their end of life cycle has expired, right? All of these things are going to cost money, and the money is going to come from somewhere, and it's going to
yeah,
trickle down, and it's going to be passed on to the customer.
it's going to be paid by the ratepayers,
Yeah.
and it's eventually got to get there. One of the other big trends, of course, is the electrification of transportation.
Hmm.
Whether it's Teslas in people's garages, or whether it's more electric vehicles for deliveries and over-the-road trucking, and municipal vehicles and all that sort of thing. Well, that's going to throw some imbalances into where the power is consumed and where it's generated. And so there's numerous trends that are hitting the grid all at once here. And just recently, just in the last 2 days, I heard that, one of the big news stories out this week about AI is that, the NVIDIA stock is skyrocketing because everybody believes that these AI chips that they're making are going to revolutionize things, and the big players are going to be buying millions of them. I heard that there was something like 2 million chips that they plan on building. I don't know if it's in the next year or two, but each one of those chips, it'll be going into a server farm somewhere for the cloud. Each one of those chips is going to require 700 watts, which is about what a typical house uses kind of as its base load. So if you've got 2 million of these
Hmm.
chips using 700 watts, where is all that power going to come from? So that's just another one of these imbalancing factors as they build out these server farms and these cloud networks. Um, there's some utilities that have just over the last couple of years have started projecting higher and higher demand across their network, across their grid, and and of course, here in Texas, like you mentioned earlier, we've got the population growth that's skyrocketing, as well as a lot of businesses coming here. So there's just a lot of forces coming into play that I think it's inevitable it's going to cost us more.
Yeah, and I think it's not just trends in policy, right? We often look at like electric vehicles as, okay, the Biden administration is pushing electric vehicles, so they're forcing us to adopt a technology that we're not ready to adopt. Okay, let's put EVs aside, even though I think that there's going to be a certain part of our transit system that is going to be electrified, whether it's train systems, it's in the larger cities, bus systems, right? There's going to become electric vehicles that are going to be working their way into our society, whether the Biden administration is pushing it or not. But that aside, just what you outlined there with with these chips, we are growing in our technology. We're growing in our demand and how we use technology, and technology is getting more advanced so quickly that we just can't possibly keep up with it. But the one thing that it does need and will continue to draw more of is electricity. So where's that electricity going to come from? And what are we going to do? Are we going to stop progressing as a society in our technology advancement because we can no longer supply the electricity? What does that do to us as a society? Where does that put us on the geopolitical front, where our enemies are burning coal and fossil fuels and putting in solar? China is a huge installer of solar. They are putting in, they're using everything that they have to create more electricity so that they could continue to make the investments in the technology that requires all of that extra electricity. And if we're not doing the same, where does that leave us?
Yeah, there's a lot of there's energy historians that have looked back at over the past history, and every form of energy we've ever found and utilized, we've never really pulled away from. We just need more and more and more energy. There's a direct correlation between economic growth, growth in the GDP, and the use of crude oil and natural gas and other forms of energy. It's one of the tightest correlations they can find out there in the financial world. Is this practically a dead on one-to-one correlation between the amount of energy used and economic growth? And so my feeling is that we're not going to move away from the fossil fuels and the older. I mean, we still use we burn as much wood as we ever have. We burn as much. I don't even think we're going to be able to do away with coal. There's just going to continue to be a demand for more and more and more energy over time. Unless, of course, we go into an economic down cycle where we've got a global depression or something like that. Well, definitely we'll have a downturn then, but I don't see that coming. And so we're just going to require more and more energy. But we've not humankind has not been able to move away from that correlation, and I don't think in our lifetime we're going to.
And one of the things I like about solar is that it's one of the quickest electricity generation sources to come online. So if we were to look at a nuclear plant, you're talking about 15 to 20 years of construction of huge billions of dollars in capital investment, regulation, inspection, huge maintenance and operation costs long term. Great source of electricity, but a lot of cost, many years. We don't have the time. If you take a look at building new natural gas plants, even new coal plants. We don't build new power plants in this country because it takes so long. There's a mountain of red tape that we need to go through. The money isn't just there because these investors have to look at that as a long-term investment. And a lot of investors are looking at maybe venture capital, or they're looking at, shoring up their investments in something that's going to be able to give them a return on their investment quicker. But with solar, you can have, between land acquisition, acquiring the land, purchasing the materials, installing it, getting the interconnection online with the utility, and then distributing that electricity, you could be looking at a year, 18 months, and maybe a few $1 million,
Yeah.
right? And then your
And
maintenance,
that's for
what
a major facility, like a utility scale. But
utility scale.
yeah,
Correct. And then your maintenance and operation is very minimal because all you have to do is basically have pest control, have weed abatement, and then keep the solar panels cleaned. And then if they're on tracking systems, it's all automated. So most of your maintenance is just going to be identified through remote monitoring. So you don't have to have a full 24-hour staff there on site, to to keep the thing running. It's really incredible.
yeah, and we've while we can't, the solar can come on very quickly, but we're not going to be able to build enough solar and wind and renewables in order to counter the kind of potential growth that we need. So we're going to have to have every kind of generation capability that we can find. But for the individual homeowner, it's a way that you can really, it's like buying insurance to separate yourself, distance yourself from the costs that are coming to the whole grid, to the potential failures of the grid and the resiliency. It just makes a lot of sense, and that's why I chose to join True Texas Solar, and and the I like to look at the whole potential from both the resiliency side of it as well as the economic side of it. And of course, from my weather background, I really enjoy looking at watching my solar panels every day start to, I look at it and I'm smiling when I see the sun coming up because I know my solar panels are about to keep me from having any costs coming from my electric utility today.
Let's talk a little bit about what you see happening in 2024. Now, one of the other things that I really like about you and that we've had conversations on is that you look at the macroeconomics of energy, not just what's going on with the local utility or what's just going on even within the Texas energy market. What what's going on geopolitically, kind of globally, that you see is maybe going to contribute to some of the costs that we're going to see this year in our energy sources, being it, the price at the gas pump or the price that we're paying for electricity, as we have these different commodity markets that are going to be positioning themselves differently as we see like these geopolitical events kind of roll out. What are your thoughts on that, and where do you think we're headed for 2024?
Well, right now we've kind of hit a Goldilocks period. Natural gas has gotten really cheap because we had such a warm winter, and Europe had a warm winter. So we've kind of gotten a reprieve here. I don't foresee this year there being a lot of price increases in terms of the utility rates. But one of the trends, and we kind of touched on this earlier, one of the big trends is deglobalization. There's a lot of manufacturing that I believe is coming back to the US. There's a lot of natural gas utilizing industries over in Europe that, because the natural gas is so expensive there, they've kind of diverted their demand over here. And so there's new plants, fertilizer plants, plastic plants being built along the Gulf Coast because we have access to vast amounts of natural gas. Natural gas the United States is really the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. And especially since the fracking, the shale gas revolution in the last 10, 15 years has really unleashed a real tsunami of natural gas. So there's a lot of this industry that's coming to the United States, and there's a lot of nearshoring, regional shoring. There's a lot of manufacturing that's kind of coming back home, coming away from China and some other places, because we learned during COVID that the supply chains can be disrupted and that there's exposure there. So I think that we're in a growth period here in the United States in terms of industrial demand, in terms of manufacturing. We've also got the LNG and the liquefied natural gas facilities that are being built on the Gulf Coast. Just in the last 6 to 8 years, we've gone from really not exporting any natural gas to the rest of the world to becoming the world leader in the export of natural gas. And just in rough terms, we generate we produce about 100 BCF, billion cubic feet a day of natural gas here in the United States and in North America. And we've gone from about zero to about 12 or 13 or 14 BCF a day that's being exported. And that amount is going to double in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. And so we're going from we're kind of awash in natural gas right now. And for those that don't know, natural gas really sets the price of electricity on the wholesale market. It's still about 40% of our generation mix. So it's kind of the marginal source of pricing. And so when natural gas goes down, then the wholesale price of electricity goes down. When natural gas goes up, the wholesale price of electricity goes up. It is almost that simple. So we're about to double the amount of export of natural gas. And some of the experts in the natural gas world will tell you that there's a fear in the next few years as we went from about 0, 6, 18 years ago to about 12, 13, 14 BCF a day now to maybe double that in a few years to the point that we'll be exporting almost a quarter of all the natural gas. So there's some concerns and some fears that were we to have a cold winter in Europe, where there's a lot of demand for this liquefied natural gas, as well as a cold winter here in the United States, that we might have to start to match global prices of natural gas. And that would be dramatic. For instance, when right now natural gas in the US is less than $2 an MCF, or an MCF, or 1,000 BTUs. In 2022, during the initial issues with the Ukraine war and the Nord Stream pipeline in Europe going offline, and there was such a huge increase in demand for LNG, the price of natural gas in Europe, it's something on the order of $70 an MCF. They have different metrics over there, but if you translate it all, it was about $50 to $70 an MCF. Whereas we were paying, the prices went up to about $8 or $9 an MCF here in the US, but went right back down last year. And now we're really plumbing the lows that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years right now because it was such a warm winter. But there's fears that we might have to become competitive in that global natural gas market if things got really tight in one of these coming winters, which would mean we might see not double or triple price in natural gas. We might see 10 or 15 or 20 times higher prices of natural gas. Well, who knows what the price of electricity might do in that case. So it's not a high probability event, but if the perfect storm were to come where it was cold, maybe even 2 winters in a row, and things got depleted in Asia as well as Europe, which are the big buyers of the global floating natural gas, or the natural gas that gets there in ships, then we could see a really extreme event. I've talked to some people in the trading, natural gas trading, energy trading world, and they feel like at some point in the next few years we can double or triple.
Yeah, my gut is telling me that that is a higher probability, not a certain.
No.
It's not certain, but if we look at what's going on in Europe right now, they're still trying to figure out what is going to be the resolution to this Russian-Ukraine war. Okay. And with the sanctions that are being levied against Russia right now, we're looking at some long-term volatility in the commodity market in Europe, just long term, as long as this war is going on. Now, that risk has been priced into the market. I think you and I were having that conversation, but that does not mean that if there was to be a change in the direction, right, it was to go one way or the other in that war, or if there was to become some other geopolitical event that happens, like China maybe taking a turn for the worse and cutting off trade routes, or blockading Taiwan or something like that. It just takes one or two global events to really trigger a domino effect in the global energy commodity market, which will have a direct impact and a very sudden impact to us as well. Because we saw gas prices get higher than we've seen them in decades. We also saw electricity prices get higher than we've seen in decades. And the only thing that was really going on geopolitically at that time was Russia was invading Ukraine. Now we have the Hamas Israel war. Who knows what's going to happen between Iran, maybe Saudi Arabia gets involved. That's huge oil producing countries now. You have China and Taiwan, the volatility there. There's huge trade routes that go between those countries. And then you have what America is doing, depending upon the outcome of the coming election. There may be a continued push towards decarbonizing our economy, or it may be full throttle, let's go and become more energy independent. So there's a lot of cards that I think need to kind of line up perfectly for this story to end up well for the American consumer. But more than likely, there's going to be some significant geopolitical risks out there for the coming future.
Yeah, in the world of geopolitics, more and more the discussion is about energy security. I mean, that's obviously front and center with Europe right now, with them pretty much wanting to distance themselves from Russia, Russia being kind of a pariah state because of its actions recently. And so Europe's wanting to distance from them, and it's really become a big issue as to, in the coming years, where is their energy going to come from? Because they became so dependent on Russia. And now it's hard for a lot of people to see how they could ever go back to being dependent on Russia again after what's happened. And so they're going to be looking to try and secure energy supplies all around the world, as well as, and you get right down to it, and yeah, there's going to be renewables is going to be an option, but it's just going to be one in the mix. It's not going to solve all of our problems, not during your or my lifetime.
Right. But one thing I can say is I can't put a natural gas drill in in the back of my yard and extract natural gas from a well that doesn't exist back there, and then
But,
convert that into energy that I could consume on site. The average person, the average homeowner, the average business, that's not an option. So they're either going to have to be moving and blowing and twisting in the winds of global commodity market pricing for these different energy services, or these different energy sources, or they're going to invest in solar, have local generation, be able to offset that load, and have more control over the price of their energy that's going to supply their home or their family. And then eventually, if we do get to communities of microgrids, which I think is a great idea, especially for some of these more remote places here in Texas, where we may be several miles from a substation or several miles of transmission line, that if one substation transformer was to go out, that entire section of Texas would just be offline until that substation came back online. So you can get together in these kind of community solar microgrid solutions and create resiliency and redundancy within a smaller community. I'd like to see that. I think that that's where we're going to end up anyway, because it's the most cost efficient way to reduce risk and to create more resiliency from an energy independence perspective. And then when you're looking at Texas being, its own interconnection part of the grid, and it's much more difficult for us to get access to overproduction of different sources of electricity over state lines. Whatever we generate is what we have available in terms of supply. And if we can't really do a great job forecasting demand, because I think we really don't have a really clear idea of just how many people are going to continue to come here. How long is this border crisis going to go on? How many additional millions of immigrants are going to be seeking asylum here, as well as businesses coming here and people from these higher tax states like New York and California also coming to Texas? There's going to be a tremendous continued demand and added strain to the grid for some time. And so we have to be looking at all fuel sources right now.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about the 2021 freeze when we came very close to losing the grid. And I think we've not seen all of the potential costs that are coming from that. They're simply going to have more reserves, more sources of generation. It's going to have to be more secure, and that's just going to cost money. That's one of the reasons why we got into that near disaster, is because we just didn't have the reserves, and people they didn't want to spend the money to have all that backup reserve running all the time. And I think it's inevitable we're going to have it, and so it's just going to cost more money. And when I look at my own personal budget, and I look at in the inflation we've seen the last 2 or 3 years, it has really kind of impacted all of us. I can't really do much about my cost of food. I can't really do much about my cost of some other thing, my insurance that I buy, but I can do something about my electric costs. And so when I put on solar on my house last year, I looked at it as, I can lock in my price of electricity for the next 30 years. And I've insulated myself from any potential future costs. And of course I was able to, get backup power with kind of the same expense at the same time. So I killed two birds with one stone. And I think that more and more people are going to become aware of that, aware of the benefits of it. And like I said earlier, it's a form of insurance that, either be it because of the grid failing or because of the extra cost in the grid, I'm in good shape. And I think
Well,
more and more people are going to decide they want to do that.
well, thanks, Mickey, so much for joining us. I can't wait to have you back on to the channel. Why don't you kind of outline your contact information? How do people get a hold of you if they're interested in going solar, interested in talking to someone who's a real energy expert? What's a good way for folks to reach out and get a hold of you?
Okay, my company is True Texas Solar. We're based in Conroe, Texas. We're a family-owned, faith-based company. We serve most of this part of Texas.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mickey. I'll make sure to put all of that contact information down below in the comment section. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much,
Okay,
and can't wait to see you again.
thank you, Will. Stay safe.